Hi, I'm Dr. Amanda McKinney, and I am the Executive Director for the Institute for Human and Planetary Health. And when Karl asked me to give a talk, he wanted me to talk about animals and the planet and humans and our interactions. Um, and I'm going to do that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the human predicament, and I'll get into the details on that. But I think that as I was thinking about preparing for this talk, I really began to think about the fact that a lot of us are searching for answers and answers to the question, why is the world in the state that it's in currently, and where are we headed and what's going to happen? And so I've made an attempt to do that here, and I hope that I'll have been somewhat successful. So again, I'm Dr. Amanda McKinney. I'm a physician. I serve as the executive director of the Institute for Human and Planetary Health at Doane University. And what I'm going to be covering today, I'm going to cover a little bit of human history. I'm going to talk about how we procure food and how that has led to our current civilizational structure, and how that's participated in the human predicament that we face now. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what's likely to happen in terms of the great simplification that's talked about. And I'm going to talk about what that means for us as individuals. So here's a little bit of human history, how we got into our predicament. So humans have been around in one form or another for about the last 6 million years. And Homo sapiens have really been around for the last 300,000 years. And we have dominated for the last 13,000 years and have been the only human species for quite some time. And, we used to be, universally, we were all hunter-gatherers. And this was a really human scale. And what I mean by human scale is that their tribes or bands of people were numbered in about 25 to 100 people per unit. And it was a very sort of egalitarian type of society. Each person was entitled to food. No one had more wealth than anyone else. No one had the right to tell anyone else what to do. So gender roles were much more equal. And there was very non-directive child rearing practices, and decisions were made by consensus. And we know a lot of this because there are current bands of hunter-gatherers that we've had the opportunity to study. And so we know a lot about what their civilizations were like. However, we had to we made this big transformation to agriculture. And it really occurred not by choice, but out of necessity. And around 12,000 BC, the last ice age ended. And what happened was that game animals became extinct, both due to climate change as well as needing to migrate out of the area. And so, humans did follow these animals. However, there was also a change in food plant distribution that the gatherers were accessing. So this resulted in some really massive changes for the human civilization. Humans also had spread across the globe by this time, and populations of people were growing. And because there was competition for living space, just due to the expanded numbers of people, and there was overlapping between hunting territories and declining game populations, this led to increased violence between groups. And so really, the hunter-gatherers were sort of forced to start to stay in one place and begin cooperating more with their neighbors, and do less hunting and move more towards domestication of animals and domestication of wild plants. And this was the Neolithic, or the agricultural revolution, which started about 10,000 years ago or so. And of course, it began really primarily in the Near East, in present-day Turkey, what was Mesopotamia and Anatolia, in that region. And again, these are some modern hunter gatherers. And agriculture was really not inevitable. We made choices about how to interact with one another and what we thought was best. But because there are current hunter gatherers now, we know that there was some reluctance to change their ways because agriculture requires more labor and time than hunting and gathering. And so, like I said, this is exemplified by the Bushmen of Southwest Africa. And because of this increased requirement for labor, and because of the issues with resource competition over resources, slavery became part of the cultural fabric. And slavery was really modeled after the domestication of animals, because once we were capable of domesticating animals, we were very able to then start to domesticate other humans that maybe didn't speak the same language, maybe didn't look like us, and we use that institution to meet the increased labor requirements of agriculture. And Jared Diamond has expressed that the adoption of agriculture, which was thought to be our most decisive step toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which we have never recovered. And the stain of slavery, I think, is one of those really important things that he was talking about. It also changed the egalitarian nature of people. So gender roles began to change. Women were subjected to, were subordinated. And so there were some really negative consequences that came along with this, as well as other issues like disease and pandemics and those kinds of things, nutritional deficiencies. But agriculture played a really big role in how our social hierarchy started to work. Again, continued warfare over these resources paved the way for certain individuals with certain leadership characteristics, for lack of a better word, to step into authoritarian roles. And, these were the kings and queens, and they lorded over the nobility, which lorded over the knights, and which lorded over the peasants. And protection was offered for a price, and loyalty was one of those prices. Taxes, a share of their grain in the harvest, and of course, there was an enforcing body, the military force, of the knights that were able to do the work of the kings and queens. And the reason that we were able to do this, that there was a small number of sort of authoritarian type folks that were able to do this, is because in order for humans to live together in groups, in tribes, once you get beyond that sort of human scale of 100 to 150 people, it becomes very difficult to maintain common myths or common stories that allow for this social cohesion. So large groups of people had to be controlled socially by followers of a big god. So, Christianity is obviously a good example of this. And because the big god not only was setting down the moral rules, but the big god was also monitoring immoral behavior. So there was an all-seeing eye that was watching over you at all times and knowing if you were doing good things or bad things. So it kept people in line, and it allowed for a king or a queen who used the concept of divine right to validate their rule. So they used religion to keep control of the masses. And part of what went along with Christianity in particular was the idea that humans had dominion over the earth. And I like this this piece from the United Church of Christ that said that, we used a passage of scripture that asked us to be stewards of the earth, and read it to grant us permission to have dominion over the earth. We think we own the earth and we can do as we please. And that has really, I think, been a foundational issue with agriculture, social hierarchy, and what has happened to our civilization, to our planet. Because once we discovered fossil fuels, it was like magic. We were able to, once we found fossil fuels, especially liquid fossil fuels, things like gasoline, a gallon of gasoline can do 100 hours of human labor for us. And this was fantastic because it did help end slavery, because we traded the institution of slavery for fossil fuels. And it was like magic, because if you look at right around here, around 1900, when, or mid 1800s, when we really began the Industrial Revolution, when James Watt invented the steam engine, that's when things really started to take off. And you can see global primary energy consumption really skyrocketed began to skyrocket in that 1900, the turn of the century time period. And you can see it's just risen logarithmically. And if you look at this graph, the same thing happens with population. So as energy use and energy consumption increased, so did world population. Okay, it grew. And I want you to pay attention to this, because energy is the key to all of this. Without energy, without fossil fuels, none of this would have been possible. You can see the same thing here. If you look at grain production, oil production, and population, they all follow the exact same trajectory. This, again, is just another depiction of the fact that the global population has continued to rise, and global cereal production has outpaced that. And that has led to, again, growing population. But when we are so focused on grain products, it has led to some real nutritional deficiencies as a result. And again, I want to make this connection between energy and our current civilization. So if you look at primary energy consumption, petroleum, natural gas, coal, and then to a smaller extent, renewable energy and electric energy, all of the things that are possible in our current civilization, me talking to you on a video through a computer, zooming across the country, flying across the planet, all of these products that we take for granted, that we use in our everyday lives, that we get on Amazon and order and have shipped across the world, halfway across the world. All of this is completely dependent on abundant and cheap fossil fuels. And of course, the United States, people in the United States use the vast majority of fossil fuel uses per capita. And so we have benefited by and large from this find. Okay, so what is the human predicament then? Okay, so you're saying, oh, that's great. Okay, well, we found fossil fuels and we've been using them and it's made our lives better. Okay, very good. So now we have a problem though, because fossil fuel use is absolutely necessary to maintain our civilization as it is. It's absolutely required for industrial agriculture that feeds 8 billion people every day. It's absolutely required for all of these products and services and travel and electricity and you name it, everything. Okay. However, continuing to burn fossil fuels is leading to climate change, which is likely to lead to civilizational decline and or collapse as a result of ecological collapse. And there's been a lot of discussion in the news lately about, the ecological collapse that we're facing. The other problem, and you say, okay, well, fine, we'll just quit using fossil fuels. But remember, fossil fuels are absolutely necessary to maintain our civilization. The other problem is that fossil fuels are finite resources, okay, and they're in decline. And without them, our economies and our levels of consumption cannot be maintained. So we are stuck. So climate change and environmental degradation as part of the human predicament. There was a report that came out in 2020. It was just shared online in August of this year by the American Meteorological Society. And basically they said that 2020 was among the top 3 warmest years on record. We now consider, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these are all pollutants. And what this report said was that greenhouse gases are now the highest on record. 2020 was one of the 3 highest temperature years on record. Global sea levels are the highest on record, and Arctic ice is near a record low. And our activities, all of our anthropogenic human activities, like agriculture, like feeding ourselves, and feeding ourselves in particular, has resulted in 40% of the Earth's land surface is now being used to produce food. Half of all accessible fresh water is used for irrigation. 90% of the fisheries have been depleted. Half of all of our forests are gone. 60% of all of our rivers have been dammed, and 50%, there's been a 50% reduction in numbers of other species since 1970. So today, in terms of just biomass, in terms of the actual weight of carboniferous mass on this planet, 36% of it is humans, and 60% is livestock, the animals we eat. And only 4% of the biomass of the planet is made up of wild animals. And you can see the drastic change that has occurred from 50,000 years ago, before the megafauna were extinct, to 11,000 years ago, right before we started agriculture, to today. We're also seeing unprecedented biodiversity loss. Vertebrates, so anything with a spine, these have declined by 52% since 1970. I mentioned that statistic earlier. And 70% of all the birds on the planet are now chickens and turkeys. There's been an 80% decline in our insect populations over the last 40 years. And it's predicted that there will be a continued 2.5% decline every year. And this is really the result of a lot of plastics and other chemicals, but also chemicals associated with the plastics. And as you can see here, this was a bird that died, a seabird that died that was the contents of its stomach, all the plastic. And it's predicted that by 2050, there will be more plastic particles than fish in the ocean. The way we're feeding ourselves not only is destroying the planet, it's destroying ourselves. We're destroying ourselves just through the kinds of foods that we're producing and eating. The dominance on animal-based foods and processed foods has resulted in 70% of US adults being overweight or obese. And 60% of those who are overweight or obese are malnourished. So they're getting enough calories, but they're not getting enough proper nutrients. And of course, these foods that harm human health are also harming planetary health through our agricultural production in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the petro-based chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides that we apply. It's destroying our ecosystems. And this is just a depiction of the fact that the greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 calories. So beef is obviously the highest. Farmed shrimp is number 2. And you can see how that goes down to where plant-based foods are at the bottom with the fewest greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a um, depiction of the 9 planetary boundaries. So Johan Rockström, who is at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm, Sweden, came up with this idea of assessing where the planetary boundaries are. So within this circle, where the green is, this is the type of activity that's within a safe boundary. Once we start getting out into this ring, this is in a zone of uncertainty, and it's increasing risk in terms of breaching these planetary boundaries. Whereas out here, you can see it's beyond the zone of uncertainty and high risk for pushing our Earth system into a non-retrievable state. So when we look at these different categories, climate change is actually now moving into the orange zone. Biosphere integrity, including biodiversity, this is a real problem. The phosphorus and nitrogen flows that we have disrupted by applying so many fertilizers. And we now believe that the novel entities, while this novel entities is really about chemical pollution, and atmospheric aerosol loading is also about chemical pollution. And there are scientists who, while they have not identified a boundary for these 2 areas yet, there are many who believe that we have breached those boundaries as well. And this is really a problem because by breaching these planetary boundaries, we risk, humans have existed and thrived really in the Holocene epoch, which is really this period that allowed us to have agriculture and have the civilization that we currently have. There is a new geologic epoch that has been proposed. It's been a new name proposed for the current geologic epoch that we live in. And instead of the Holocene, people are describing this as the Anthropocene. In other words, it's the era or the epoch of human-induced activity that is fundamentally changed the Earth system itself, and how all of these various ecosystems interact with one another. And this is leading to some really severe problems in terms of human health. This just came out in September, and this is from the United States government saying that climate change is the greatest threat to public health. And the Department of Health and Human Services has now created a division on climate change because of this issue. And the impact of climate change on human health is not to be taken lightly. We've seen all sorts of storms that have disrupted water systems, destroyed people's homes, and can lead to all sorts of human health implications. And you can see here, these are just some: extreme heat, again, severe weather, air pollution. 1 million people die every year just from, 1 million excess deaths per year just based on bad air quality across the globe. Changes in vector ecology, so new viruses. The coronavirus that's causing the COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example of this. And of course, it goes on. And again, deaths from climate change are not distributed equally. So while we have benefited the most from fossil fuel use, the predicted number of deaths from climate change is obviously is impacting people in the global South to a far greater extent. So the people who've done the polluting are being less affected than by the people who have not done the polluting to any significant degree. So depletion. So we are living in a unique time period where fossil fuels fossil fuel use began really in earnest in the mid 1800s. and have peaked at this current time. And it's believed that we are now post peak fossil fuel, and the availability of fossil fuels is going to begin to decline. And we know that that's true because, we have all sorts of graphs that I didn't put in here, but I could show you. But we also know that all you have to do is look at the situation that we have. It used to be that just like the Beverly Hillbillies, Uncle Jed was shooting at some food, and the oil just came spurting up through the ground when he shoots the squirrel. But that's not the situation anymore. Now we have we're digging in the tar sands to try to squeeze oil out of this toxic substance, sand-like substance that we have in Canada. Fracking. We're doing all sorts of fracking to get to shale oil and shale gas. And so if there were lots of easily accessible oil, we would have tapped into it by now. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. This chart is from the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. It was first published in 1972, and there was an update in 2002, a 30-year update. And the Club of Rome was a group of, and still is, a group of scientists and academics and economists and all sorts of people who commissioned this report in 1972 about the limits for growth. And it was written by Dennis and Donella Meadows, as well as a few other people. But they looked, they made the presumption back then that there are limits to continued growth. So we talk all the time about, you hear in the news about needing to grow the economy. We have to grow this, we have to grow that. Well, the reality is we cannot continue to grow on a finite planet. And so the group that wrote the Limits to Growth, they looked at different metrics like food per capita, services per capita, global pollution, and industrial output per capita, as well as population. And when they started in 1970, they made predictions. And the predictions you can see are these dotted lines. Okay, so they predicted that that industrial output per capita would peak and then decline. All right. They made a prediction that population would peak around 2030 and then begin to decline. And they believed that food per capita would also peak and decline. Again, when the report was written around 1970, the solid line is what actually occurred. Okay, so this is where they got to in 1970. And then you can see when they did the 30-year update in the year 2000, you can see the solid line pretty well followed what they had predicted. And obviously it remains to be seen what's going to happen here. But the modeling continues to improve. And it's very likely that this scenario is actually what's going to occur. So what's not likely to happen? And now this is according to Nate Hagens, who, I'm going to move this so you can see it. Nate Hagens, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota. And he teaches a course called Reality 101 to all of the freshman honor students. And these are the things that he tells his students are not likely to happen in the future. He believes that we're not likely to grow the economy and mitigate the sixth mass extinction, which we're currently in, as I depicted by all of the biodiversity loss, as well as climate change. We're not likely to be, we can't do both. We can't grow the economy and address our environmental issues. We're not likely to grow the economy by getting rid of fossil fuels and replacing them with what he calls rebuildables, which are what we also are better known as renewables. And there are lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that wind turbines and solar panels, they're great technology. However, they still require fossil fuels to build them. And wind turbines and solar panels, need to be replaced. So that's why he calls them rebuildables or replaceables rather than renewables. And it also doesn't address our problem with liquid fuels. So things like gasoline and oil, those are not easily replaced by, electrifying things. We're also not likely to choose to leave fossil carbon in the ground because it's so tethered to our experiences, our life standards, our wages, our profits, our growth, the cheap stuff what we buy, including the food that we eat. And governments are not likely to embrace the limits to growth before limits to growth are well passed. And I think that that's probably something that everyone can kind of resonate with. So what is likely to happen? And again, this is according to Nate Higgins. We're going to grow our gross energy while the net declines. In other words, when we're scraping the bottom of the barrel to get tar sands and frack oil, the amount of energy that it takes to actually get that out of the ground is enormous. And so when all you have to do is, stick a well in the ground, just stick a pump in the ground and pump and you get oil, you don't have to put a lot of energy in to get a lot of energy out. However, when you're trying to dig out and process tar sands, you have to use a lot of energy just to get the oil out in the first place. So the net energy that you have left is much smaller. We're going to have all kinds of technologically feasible energy schemes that aren't really going to produce much energetic contribution to society. He says we're going to have modern monetary theory, which is basically the idea that we're going to print money from the government. And because the government can never go bankrupt, we're going to spend it in the real world. But again, modern monetary theory is really divorced from this biophysical understanding of energy and resources. So we can print all the money we want, but if there aren't any resources to back it up, it's not really going to make much of a difference. We're going to have conversations about universal basic income because a lot of the people in our country are broke. Over half of people don't have $500 in savings to be able to spend on an emergent situation. And we're going to have to support them. Otherwise, it's going to be really bad. If people don't have access to basic services like food and heat and housing, we're going to have a real problem. And we're also going to have fewer environmental regulations. We saw, especially, during the Trump administration, we saw a withdrawal of protection of national parks. Brazil with Bolsonaro, he's burning the Amazon to plant soybeans, and the Amazon is already 20% gone. And it's believed that once we reach 40% of the Amazon gone, we will have reached a really significant environmental tipping point with respect to climate change. We're going to put pedal to the metal on all of this stuff until we hit a wall, because that's how we do. And we will hit a wall. It is coming. And Nate Higgins predicts that in the next decade, we're going to face something called the Great Simplification. And he predicts that it will be about a 30% drop in GDP, which was very similar to what happened during the Great Depression. Now, a 30% decline will bring us back to 1993 levels of economic activity, which, wouldn't be so bad. But again, that's US levels, and we don't necessarily share, so there may be some issues with spreading the love around equally, if you know what I mean. Okay, so that was super depressing. I'm sorry. So now what are we going to do? Well, first we have to keep calm and carry on. That's number one. But what can you do as an individual? Well, first of all, you need to think for yourself. There's so much of this sort of consensus trance that's out there. And again, these are things, I don't want you to think that these are ideas that I have come up with solely on my own. I'm modeling this after Dr. Higgins' course. But the idea that the consensus encompasses is that, we just need to have the Green New Deal so that we can have renewable energy. We just need to move everything from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and everything will be fine. It's not quite that simple. It would be wonderful if that were the case. It's just not that simple. So think for yourself, and also think critically. Do your homework. Do some reading. Start to investigate these issues, and do what you can. Also, remember that the best things in life are free after our basic needs are met. So we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, shelter, safety. Once we have those things in place, the best experiences in life really are free. Don't try to keep up with the Joneses. Really, it's about changing. We've been held hostage to a culture of consumerism for a really long time, and it's hard to break away from that. But it's really important to try. Also, unplug from technology and get out into nature. I think this is something that's really important. People like me and people in my age group, I think, are still able to potentially do this. I think we really need to work on this with our younger generation. We have to get them to unplug from some of this stuff, and stop staring at their phones 24/7. Also, choose your tribe carefully. Surround yourself with people who think the way you think. That can be dangerous. But if you're surrounding yourself with people who are positive, people who are community minded, who are doing things to improve the health of themselves, the health of their family, the health of the planet, the health of their community, those are the folks that you want to spend your time with. Simplify your life. Beat the rush. We can do with less, and we should start to try, because less is coming, whether you're ready or not. Try to imagine what the trajectory might be in the next decade and make your choices accordingly. I know a lot. Dr. Higgins does say that, he's had students that have changed their career plans based on what they learned in his course. So I think we all need to do that for ourselves. We need to start looking at where we think the future might be headed, and act accordingly. And part of that is to learn a physical skill or several. Growing food, knowing how to grow food, knowing how to sew, knowing how to cook. Simple things that people used to do, and maybe they're not simple, but they were life necessitating skills that everyone had and they needed to have in order to get by. We need to start learning those things again. A lot of people really don't know how to do anything for themselves. Maximize your impact. Don't minimize it. Try to make a difference at a larger scale than your own life. In other words, we can all be very easily shamed by, eating a hamburger, right? Or taking a trip on an airplane. And I would say that you definitely need to try to minimize, the harm that you do in your life. However, just by trying to minimize, you're not maximizing your impact. The way to maximize your impact is to not focus on all of those sort of details, but rather to really reach out into your community and find out what can you do to make a positive impact. What can you do to help the situation, rather than just looking inwardly at, well, what are all the things I can do to stop being part of the problem, right? Instead of, don't be part of the problem, but rather try to find a way to be a part of the solution. I have some suggested reading here for you. Again, this is Bottlenecks for the 21st Century. This is by Dr. Nate Higgins. And this is the book that he uses sort of as his textbook for his Reality 101 class. You can also find his videos on YouTube. Reality 101 videos on YouTube. He's sort of taken his semester-long course and condensed it into just a few videos, 4 to be precise. Also, Power. This is a fantastic book. It's written by Richard Heinberg. It's just recently been released. But he goes through a lot of what I've talked about today, and he goes through it in great detail and in a much more eloquent way than I have or can. And then this is a white paper that was written by Jason Bradford called "The Future is Rural." And Jason is he's a farmer. He's a PhD biologist, and he works for the Post Carbon Institute as well. But he makes the case that we are going to have to move back to we have urbanized, right? So more than half of all humanity lives in cities currently. And he believes that the future is going to be more rural, that there's going to be a backward migration of people back into the rural areas. There's going to have to be, with less energy, there's going to have to be a relocalization of economies, of communities, of food production. And that's not all bad. And even though, people are very afraid to have less, not have as much as we have now, we can do this. We can change our society. We can change our culture to be more localized. And we're going to really have to. And I think it's important that we work on that before we're forced to do so. I also have a few useful websites here for you. ihph.doan.edu is the site for my Institute for Human and Planetary Health. Energy in Our Future is Nate Hagen's institute, which there's some really good information there. You can find his videos for his course there as well. Postcarbon.org is the Post-Carbon Institute. That's where you can find Richard Heinberg and Jason Bradford. And then resilience.org is just a really great website that they post new articles that are interesting reading on a daily basis. And this is my final slide. And I typically end my presentations with this slide because I think that it helps remind me that I need to have a positive attitude. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that was written by, those words were spoken by Margaret Mead. She was an anthropologist and author. And I think that this is more true today than it ever has been. And I invite you to be a part of that small group of thoughtful, committed citizens that can change the world. Thank you.